Hmm?
Every time you reach the top of another hill, be looking for the next hill and actually be looking for the next valley too, because even though it's going to be scary going in it, the only way you can get to the next hill and that excitement and that elation is by going through that valley. And sometimes the valleys will be simple and shallow, and sometimes they'll be swamp infested with dragons flying over and dead bodies floating in the water. It's a Lord of the Rings reference.
Podcast Junkies, episode 76. If you're new to the show, this is The Podcaster's Voice. It's the show where we talk to engaging, fantastic personalities behind the microphone who host their own show and who I like to get to know a little bit better, and I want you to know a little bit better and get an insight into their personalities. So we talk about all things podcast related and not podcast related. If you missed last week's episode, we had a fun conversation with Eric and Grace of Under the Comic Covers. They're part of my podcasting family, Podcastica, and it was a nice opportunity to get to know them a little bit better and to have you, the listeners, get a little peek behind or under the comic covers, if you will, to see what makes them tick. I was thinking about the intro to the show, and I always like to welcome new listeners, and regular listeners will hear this intro week in and week out. So I thank you for the patience you have in listening to this, or maybe you're just forwarding to this. I still love you guys. A friend of mine was listening to the podcast, someone who is not a regular podcast listener, but was visiting my wife and I for the holidays. Hello, Juan Carlos. I'm talking to you. And you know that you don't really mention your name at the beginning of the podcast. And I was like, you're right. And I think part of that was a bit of maybe fear is the word of mind, apprehension, or I don't know, some other imposter syndrome as to not going like full out, full bore with me injecting myself as the personality behind the show, really relying on Podcast Junkies as the brand and as being what's up front and center with regards to this podcast. The funniest thing about Podcast Junkies, the name, is when people on social media, they're like, hey guys, please check this out, or check out our podcast, or thanks for the support, guys. First of all, it could be a guy and a girl, or it could be all girls, or it could be what it really is, just me. And my name is Harry Duran. For those of you that actually don't know, I am the host of this show, and it's just me, and I've been doing it since April of 2014. So I think it's probably a nice thing to do every now and then, let you know who is the captain of this ship and who's the MC for your evening or morning or afternoon festivities. So I appreciate, again, like I said, all my new listeners, all my existing listeners, and all my listeners who aren't listening yet. Make sure you tell a friend, and we'll listen to the end of the episode when I have a retention hashtag. And that's really for what I call Podcast Junkies to tweet about, and to just, it's a little thing we do to let me know who's listening. And if you were listening last week and paying attention, there was a surprise there at the end, and a couple of people did it, and now they get their free gift from me. In case you missed it last week, we spoke to Eric and Grace of Under the Comic Covers, and they're members of my Podcastica family. And related to that, we have some very good news. We get to welcome a new member to Podcastica. It's the One Mind meditation podcast hosted by Morgan Dix. And Morgan, as you might remember, loyal listeners, he was on episode, let's see now, going back here, I'm looking at my notes. I knew this would take longer than I thought. 71, sorry. I was looking back at my posted board. He was episode 71, and we talked about meditation, and I had the privilege of being on his show, and we talked for almost an hour about meditation. So he's been a longtime friend, and as soon as I was on his show, I shared the podcast with my fellow Podcastica members, and we were all in agreement that it would be amazing to have him as part of the Podcastica family. So him and his business partner, Tom, have joined us, and we're extremely happy to have them on board and as members of the Podcastica family. So we should be updating the site pretty soon. But when you get a chance, go head on over to aboutmeditation.com for the fantastic podcast. And it's just another way we're rounding out the variety of shows that we have on Podcastica. So this week, in my efforts to branch out, I am always participating in Facebook groups and blabs related to podcasting. And a couple of weeks ago, I met Ron Dawson. And let me just tell you guys, this is a fantastic show. And the minute I heard it, I started to binge listen on all the old ones. And I knew right away I was going to have him on the show. So I reached out. We were able to make the schedule work. And as you can tell, once I'm done talking here, we hit it off very well. And that's why this is an hour-plus conversation, like all my super fun ones are. So I'm glad you're going to get to know him. I think he's a really, really nice guy. Like I said, we were hitting on all cylinders in terms of cultural references. We have a lot of fun. We laugh a lot. And now I'm happy that you get to know Ron Dawson of Radio Film School. So, Mr. Ron Dawson, thank you for being a guest on Podcast Junkies.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, I always like to put some context in here in terms of how we connected, and it's just a reminder of all the different ways we can find each other, and why it's important for podcasters to just keep trying different platforms. And so we connected on Blab.
Right.
And it was interesting because it was a podcast fan day that Blab put together. And for the listener who doesn't know what Blab is, it's a much easier form of online chatting with video than Google Hangouts, or maybe what Google Hangouts aspires to be someday.
Yeah. I mean, it's in a way it's kind of similar to Periscope too, because it's a way to do on-demand video streaming.
Yeah, and so I was following a couple of friends that I had in the podcasting space, and then you popped into one of the chats, and we engaged. And I'm always curious as to what people's podcasts are, so I started. I looked at yours, and then I think later on that day, I checked out one of the episodes, and I was just really impressed with the quality of it, and I started. As I'm prone to do, fell down the rabbit hole of podcasting and binged, listened.
Oh, thank you, appreciate that.
So yeah, and I thought, and then the more I listened to the show, the references you were putting in there were killing me, because we're obviously from the same generation. And you were like you dropping Brady Bunch references, I Love Lucy samples. I was like, oh man, this is crazy. We're gonna have a good time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, to give people context for what Harry's talking about, I start each episode with a story or anecdote that I like to connect to whatever the topic is that day in some crazy way. And part of what I like to do is dip into my my pool of nostalgia and pop culture nostalgia from when I was just a lad.
A wee lad.
Just a wee lad.
But it's funny because it reminds me of that HBO show that came out. One of the, I don't know, when it was about this kid who grew up on TV. I don't know if you remember that show. And all his references were about like TV, because he was like raised on it.
On TV, or grew up
just watching it. And it's just like there's a montage in the beginning. Yeah. And it was a montage in the beginning of just him stuck in front of the TV screen, and just
interesting.
All those shows had an influence on how he was later in life.
Well, one of the things, I don't know if I've talked about this on this show, but growing up as a kid, during my formative years, I was raised by a single mom. And my brother and I, every Saturday, would watch TV literally from about 6 a.m. to till we went to bed at night, like nonstop television.
Wow.
And part of that was because my mom, was a single mother who worked as a nurse. She often worked the midnight shift. And so Saturdays was her day to catch up on some much needed sleep. So the TV in essence was a built-in at-home babysitter.
Yeah.
So, which for a lot of, kids growing up in the 70s who had single parents, I'm sure that was the case. So yeah, we'd be camped out in front of television all day Saturday and stop to eat lunch and dinner and then go back. And then I don't know if it was called this, but I guess I was also somewhat of a latchkey kid. I don't even know if that's a term that's used anymore, but growing up, I do remember when I was in the second grade, my elementary school was right across the street from the apartment complex where we lived. And if my mom wasn't home, when I got home, I would let myself in. So I guess technically that's a latchkey kid. And I would jump right to Lost in Space. That was one of my favorites growing up. Had a huge crush on Penny Marshall.
You had a couple of crushes, I
had a lot of crushes. I had a crush on pretty much every pretty girl I saw on TV, from Tootsie to. Do you remember that show, Electra Woman and Dinah Girl?
Yes.
I don't know if it was Hanna-Barbera or Sid and Marty Krofft. Huge crush on Electra Woman, who was like a star on As the World Turns, as it turns out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway,
so
don't get me started, Harry.
Just to round off your crushes, you also had a crush on one of the Brady girls.
Yeah. So I guess most kids growing up liked Marsha. I always had a thing for Jan. And in the episode where I talk about that, it's funny because my wife is blonde. I'm African American, for those who don't know, but my wife is a blonde middle child. So I don't know if that's a Jan thing or
a Marsha thing.
It's not a Marsha thing. She was a middle child. But
the blonde, right? Marsha's blonde.
But they were all blonde.
Jan wasn't like brownish brunette?
No, they were all blonde. I think there's an episode where she dyed her hair or something, or she tried to differentiate herself. But yeah, all the girls, growing up, three little girls all with hair of gold. Remember that? It's an opening song, Harry.
Of course. How could I forget that?
Yeah.
I was the middle boy, because there's 4 siblings. There's a younger sister, and then there's 3 boys, and I was the middle boy. So I was always vibing with Peter.
Yeah. So anyway, I grew up a television kid, and now I incorporate a lot of those stories sometimes into the opening anecdotes for my show.
You also had a thing for Dorothy, right?
I did, but who didn't? Come on. Who didn't? And I made a point to say that heterosexual guys can have a thing for Dorothy too. Because, there's that whole thing about gay guys really into
that's funny.
being into her. So, but yeah, I had, you did your homework. You're awesome. I had, it was an episode, we did a Wizard of Oz special. But I remember I used to daydream about like rescuing Dorothy from the witch when I was a kid.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How thoroughly did you have this scenario mapped out?
I don't remember. I just, but I did. I really had a thing for like the girl next door. So Gilligan's Island. I was, who was it? It was either
Ginger and Marianne.
I was Marianne. Okay. Like Ginger didn't do anything for me as a kid, but Marianne, and it wasn't because the short shorts, like but some people might think. I think it was there was something about the girl next door that the sensitive kid in me really connected with.
Very cool. So, I think it's more of that, like finding the librarian hot aesthetic.
Probably. Well, my wife loves to read.
Okay.
So she's I don't know if that you said librarian. My wife's not one, but she loves to read.
So yeah, it was just interesting because there's so many cultural references that shape who we are, and then the fact that you bring it into the show is really a lot of fun. And it just I think I always tell podcasters all the time, they get so stuck in their topic that they show day in and day out, week in, week out, whatever they talk about their topic, and they don't allow any of their personality to come through. And I think what you do by bringing back those references, it puts a smile on my face, and anyone from our generation, I'm sure it does as well. And then you have these sessions where you're just rapping with your boy JD, and those are some of my favorite. So those are some of my favorite episodes because, to give context for people listening, my show is, I like to call it This American Life for filmmakers. So it's a documentary style podcast. It's scripted, but
But the segments where I do interject, and so I'll take bits and pieces from interviews I do with filmmakers and other artists, and I kind of cut them into the show. So those interviews obviously aren't scripted, but the parts I do in between are. But whenever I have segments with my friend JD, like other interviews, they're not scripted, but because he and I have this rapport that goes back, all the years that we've known each other, whereas filmmakers, we would stay up late at night debating about movies and stuff like that. That kind of comes out. And because for our friendship, he can talk to me and, clown me all he wants on the show. And I think it makes for good content on the show too.
Definitely does.
Yeah.
So, you talk a lot about in the first couple of episodes how you were inspired, how you were inspired to go down the path of filmmaking. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, what was inspiring you at the time you decided you wanted to start a podcast, and then add to it or give it the aesthetic that this high quality that seems like it's very important to you for everything that you do.
Yeah, actually, I have a great story behind that. So I originally actually started podcasting back in 2007. So this podcast is actually the third that I've had over the years. And, I started my video production company in 2002. And in 2005, like a lot of videographers, I started off primarily doing weddings. And then in 2007, 5 years into my gig as a wedding videographer, I made a switch to doing primarily corporate work, which is what I do now. And in 2007, I did a video for an expo called WPPI, the Wedding and Portrait Photographers International. It's like one of the largest photographer conventions in the world. And in doing that, I ended up doing a lot of work for the professional photography industry. Excuse me. So it turned out that it became like a niche of mine. Now, there is this interesting dynamic between photographers and videographers where photographers oftentimes don't look too highly of videographers, at least back then. And it's kind of different now, especially with DSLRs. And so I didn't want to be looked at as the quote unquote video guy when I was going around and doing all of these videos for the photography industry. So I started a podcast where I was interviewing high profile photographers on my show, very similar to the Terry Gross show, Fresh Air. So I called my show, it was F-Stop Beyond, and I called it Fresh Air for Photographers. Cool. And so I think I have this thing for like NPR style titles and numbers. And so I started that podcast really as a marketing strategy, so that when other photographers heard me or saw me, instead of seeing me as Ron Dawson, or instead of seeing me as that video guy, they would say, "Oh, there was Ron Dawson, co-star of F-Stop Beyond or host of F-Stop Beyond." And so it was a way to kind of put myself on the same pedestal as some of these photographers that I knew a lot of people I was working on were going to be admiring. And so I did that show for a couple of years, and it was just pretty much like a one-on-one interview with photographers. And I interviewed people like Chase Jarvis and Vincent LaFerre and Jerry Guionis and all these, big names in the wedding and commercial photography space. And I really got into it, and I did that for a couple of years. But as a filmmaker, I was kind of missing out on talking to other filmmakers, like the way I talk to photographers. So in 2010, I ended F-Stop Beyond, and I started a podcast called Crossing the 180, which was essentially the same thing as F-Stop Beyond, but instead of primarily speaking with photographers, I was speaking with filmmakers. So it was a one-on-one conversation with filmmakers, again, like a 45-minute show or whatnot. And then at the end of 2013, at the time, podcasting for me was just a side project. Like I had some sponsorships, but it was not like my main focus as a business. And at the end of 2013, I decided that with the copious free time that I had, I wanted to work on my passion project films as opposed to podcasting. And so I ended Crossing the 180. And so for a couple of years, I didn't do any kind of podcasting. And then last year, which would be 2015 now, my wife and I were talking and we decided, we should, because we moved from Atlanta to Seattle. And so we came in this area. And so we said, we should look into other business models other than just video production. Because right now, the way I make my money is I shoot video for companies and organizations and make videos out of them. But we wanted to create some type of system of being able to generate revenue through content that we would produce. So what we talked about was bringing back podcasts. And by this time, podcasting had starting to become popular. There were a lot of podcasts in the film and video space that were starting, and they were all interview-based. So I didn't want to do another interview-based one. So as I mentioned on the show, I toyed around with doing sort of like a talk show style with JD and his wife. She was unable to do it because she started to work for Netflix. And so I decided if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do something different. And so I decided that I was going to make my show like This American Life, which was, I'm a big fan of, where I would interview a bunch of filmmakers and have a specific topic I would talk about on each show, and then just pull from each interview sound bites and segments that kind of relate to that topic. And as far as I know, it was the only filmmaking related podcast that is that style, that is this storytelling, narrative, journalistic, documentary style, as opposed to the straight one-on-one interview style. And so I knew if I was going to go back into it, I would have to do something that would really stand out. And that's what I did.
And that's why it sounds so awesome.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a lot of work goes into it. Sometimes I think, in the beginning, I was thinking this a lot. I mean, I'm starting into my groove now, but over the first few, I was like, oh my gosh, what the hell have I gotten myself into?
Well, I think it's just a testament to how seriously you were taking it, and the fact that you've done a couple already.
Yeah.
In essence, what you did is you created a love letter to podcasting.
Thank you.
And that's a reference back to one of your episodes where you talked about directors making what they called a love letter to the movies.
To cinema.
Cinema, yeah.
Yeah, that was your first time episode, and I was using love as a metaphor for your first time as a filmmaker. Yeah,
and I think I like how you make copious use of movie samples too. So those always bring a smile to my face. And there must be a lot of research involved in finding, just focusing on the snippets, the movie snippets, for example, to find the right piece that's going to convey the right mood. Because the ones you've been picking so far have been spot on, and they sort of set the context for what you're going to talk about in that episode.
Well, it's funny you say that, Harry, because my wife joked about this on a Facebook post where she was commenting about one of the episodes, and she said something to the fact now you have a reason to use something it was jokingly, but it was in love, but something along the lines now you have an excuse to use all those movie and TV references, because I'm always throwing out movie and television references to her, and she's not she likes movies, but she's not as crazy about them as I am. She's a reader, and so I'm always throwing out all of these movie and television references that seemingly come out of nowhere. And so I honestly actually don't have to do a lot of research because it's already there. It's really the other way around. It's okay, how can I come up with an episode, an excuse to use all of these movie sound bites that are rolling around in my head?
That's funny because I do something similar because I grew up as a DJ.
Oh, cool!
And I grew up spinning vinyl, and although
like a party DJ or like a radio DJ.
No, like a party DJ. I mean, if you could see behind me, you could
mixing
see
and scratching.
There's my vinyl and my turntables right there as well. So
awesome, man!
Yeah,
looks good.
I learned on old school. I had a beat match on vinyl. So
yeah, nice.
And then I grew up, early '80s. So literally hip hop was being born, and watching Beat Street and all those movies. And
have you heard my latest episode yet?
Not the latest one.
Okay, so my latest episode is called uh, what is it called? I don't even know the name of my latest episode. But I go into.
I can tell you. It's called the Salieri Syndrome.
Oh yeah, the Salieri Syndrome. Thank you, the Salieri Syndrome, where I talk about. Right, basically, it's about how do you cope with feeling mediocre as an artist, which is anyone who's any kind of artist at some point has felt like that. And the opening story is a breakdancing story, and so. You being a DJ, I think you're going to really appreciate it. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to
Yeah, I always like to, whenever I focus on and then we talk about specific episodes, we just dance around like what the topic is. And I'm like, and then I tell the listener, look, you got to go check it out. Listen to the show, download it, and then you'll get hooked.
Yeah, I think they'll like this one. And this one, like this latest one, is it's a good example of my basic format in terms of, opening story that's funny, the anecdotal, then going into like what I call that the intro, and then part one, which is like the first half that kind of sets up the topic and gets into the topic a little bit, and then we cut to a sponsor break, then we cut to the second half, which is the final half, and then we go into credits. And then I always try to have a post-credit segment because it's like a fun bonus segment for the listeners, but also it's an incentive to get people to listen through the credits and the post-roll sponsor segments. So I think that one's it's a good example of the format that I try to keep the show in. And again, if you're any kind of an artist, I think the message in that one is something that would really relate to you. And that's another one that uses movie references. In this case, Amadeus.
No Beach Street or Breaking.
No movie clips from that, but there is a tangential reference to that. Which
I'm excited now.
Yeah, you'll like it.
But you talked about the format of the podcast. So we were talking a bit before we started recording about your interesting numbering scheme, and I think it seems like you've experimented with a couple of different varieties. But just for the benefit of the listener, I'm a bit OCD about these things.
Here it comes.
So I know in the beginning you started out with the title, and then you said, well, maybe I should put some numberings on it. So there's obviously in 001, but then you needed to add some context to 001. So there's a 001.5. And then you realized...
you have a 1.5.
Yeah, you do have a 1.5. And then you realize, well, it's called Radio Film School, so maybe I should put the letters in there. So there's an RFS 002. I'm like, okay. But then you're like, I got to add more content to that. So now there's an RFS bonus. And I was like, okay, what's that? And then there's just a plain old bonus in all caps. And I'm like, oh, that must be something completely different. And now there's an RFS 006.5 and in brackets bonus. So that's a bonus to the 0.5. I'm like, whoa, this is crazy. And
you're cracking me up here. You're killing me.
And then we're back to SE07, which I think is a reference to now short ends, which I'm wondering why it's not RFS SE07, but that would make
well, actually it is. It is now.
It is now. And then there's an in brackets SE08. And the latest and greatest is in brackets RFS-FJ009.
People listening to this are going to be like, what the hell is this about?
So if you're trying to follow along, don't. Just
ignore the number scheme. I'm getting into a groove. Like any show, you get into a groove. And so, as we were saying before we started rolling, one of the complications with my show is that there's really like two shows. So there's the main show, which is where every season we explore a particular topic, and that one's called A Filmmaker's Journey, and that's the one that's more heavily edited, and that's the one where they are usually longer, and because they take so long to edit, it's a bi-weekly show. But I didn't want to have a gap or a 2-week long wait, so I wanted to put in shorter episodes in the interim. And those are the short ends episodes, and short ends is a filmmaking reference, and so those are usually like shorter, more simpler documentary style episodes that are about any kind of topic related to cinema or television or whatnot to kind of hold you over into the next episode. So having a straight like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 number scheme didn't work because you had these two different shows. So anyway, as you have so thoroughly illustrated, my number scheme is like all over the place up to now. So at the beginning of the year, I decided, okay, I'm going to have like RFS, like you said, because radio film school, and then a dash, and then have like an SE for a short ends episode and an FJ for a filmmaker's journey episode, because those are individually numbered. And then I'm going to put the number at the end of the title. Because, I was saying before, I was on another podcast, the Digital Convergence podcast with Carl Olson. He was saying the episodes that for him that kind of stood out were the ones that didn't have any numbers in the beginning. So, and sort of like given the kind of topics that I do, I think having the topic be front and center versus the number is more important. And then if someone's really interested in the number, they can look at the end of the title. So we'll see how long that lasts.
3 episodes.
Right.
And then you'll actually like spell out the words like episode T20, TWENT.
Exactly.
And it'll take up every space you have available in iTunes, and people will just be like, I don't have no idea what this is about now.
Don't put it past me. Don't.
So, in terms of everything that has taken you to where you are now, and the things that have inspired you, obviously TV and film played a big role. But before a podcaster, you were also an aspiring hip hop producer, if I if I remember my earlier shows correctly.
Hardly really. Like I wouldn't ever say, like when I was in college for a brief stint, and I talk about this in one of the episodes, me and 3 other partners attempted to start a artist management company, which, have you seen Straight Outta Compton yet?
No, not yet.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. Yeah, I would not have lasted in like Ruthless Records or Aftermath or any of those. We started this artist management company because we had this hip hop group. So this would have been like late 80s, early 90s. And it was out of Oakland, California. And the group was called Shadow Soul. And one of our partners kind of quote unquote discovered them, and we were going to represent them. And the whole thing was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare. But like that nightmare was inadvertently not what led me to becoming a filmmaker, because like 10 years later, when telling the story about that whole ordeal, I was just commenting how in retrospect I could laugh at it and how it would make such a funny movie. And so I wanted to go to a film school to kind of learn about movie making so I can make a movie about this experience. I never made the movie, but I fell in love with filmmaking. That's how I became a filmmaker. But yeah, that was the SOS Atlantis episode. I think that was I think that's RFS 003.
For those of you following along.
For those of you who've been paying attention to my crazy numbering scheme.
What was interesting about that is just a reminder of all the crazy things we try when we're younger. I actually partnered with a friend, and we had a brief stint to try to manage a band, and that obviously didn't work out as well. Yeah. But the other thing that I thought was funny that I was reminded of, because it was back in like the breakdancing days, is in high school. I went to an all-boys Catholic high school, so and it was like super preppy, and we had to wear blazers. But I mean, there was just these cliques, right? And yeah. I'm Latino, so I was like, okay, the brothers and the Latinos, we're gonna go hang out over here. Right. And we were into like hip hop. One of the guys had a boombox, and he was like blasting Roxanne Shante, and it was just like, yeah, that's what we're gonna do. And so we're like, yeah, we should form a crew. And we're like, oh man. Right. So we naturally had to be something like b-boy hip hop related.
Now, were you a dancer?
I wasn't a break dancer, but I love dancing, and I still go out dancing with my wife, and we go dancing to like house music now.
Oh, nice, cool.
But and that's what I DJ now. But Yeah, I've always envisioned myself like I could never pull off a windmill. You know, I could.
Oh, you're gonna love my episode, dude. You are gonna love my episode. The fact that you said windmill.
The best I could do is some popping and locking. You know,
Yeah.
that's about
So
it.
funny.
But I've always been fascinated, man, by just being able to throw some cardboard down and just knock out some windmills and some head spins and all that stuff. That
Yeah.
scene in Beach Street, the battle at the Roxy, was
Right.
literally, that thing still gives me chills to this day, because I stare at it and I'm just like, that is the epitome of like b-boy battle. It is
Right.
awesome. Yeah.
That's the one at the end. Is that talking about at the end?
I think it's the one towards, it might be in the middle. It's just
Okay.
like when they're in the big club and they all start circling each other.
Oh, right,
And then,
right.
then they just go back and forth in the battling scenes.
Is that the scene where the little kid gets discovered, kind of, by
No,
Ray Dong Chang?
no, he gets discovered. Well, yeah, I think she saw him there. Yeah, she
Right.
saw him there, and then she put him in the show.
Right. And I remember thinking, I didn't think he was all that good
No.
compared to.
No, it's only because he's like the actor in the movie, so they're like,
Right,
oh, they got to
right,
make
right.
him. I'm like, Crazy Legs. Yo, throw
Yeah,
Crazy Legs up there or
yeah.
something.
Beach Street. Beach Street was the bomb growing up. If you were into breakdancing, that movie was awesome.
So we called our crew Homeboy Nation.
Homeboy Nation. Cool. Was
we
that
had-
a reference to the movie? I don't remember.
No, I mean just like homeboys and
Yeah,
stuff
I got
like that.
it.
I think we even went to the level of having sweatshirts made
Nice.
with
nice.
like the tagging graffiti font. And stuff.
Ah, very cool. Very
So-
cool. Yeah, you're gonna dig that episode then.
So yeah, it was cool. But so it's interesting because you know what you're saying is that experience that you had, you know, trying to start the group, you were able to learn some lessons from that. And I think it's so much. It just kind of speaks to the fact that everything we do is there's a lesson to be learned in it somehow, and I think we just have to pay attention to stuff that worked, and especially stuff that didn't work. You know, in terms of what not to do later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, numbering schemes, they don't really work out.
The other thing that I've really enjoyed about your show is your ability to sort of open up and, you know, be personal at times. I mean, you've shared stories about your father and how you were, again, you just alluded to it earlier, how you were raised by your mother. And one of the really, really touching moments, I think, was when you talked about the tapes that your mother made.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because that really resonated with me, and just the effect it had on you, and as you know, as a little kid, and what happened as a result of that.
Yeah, that was so cool. My father, my biological father, a couple of years ago, he found some old tapes that my mother had recorded for him. So obviously, you know, my mom and dad separated when I was about 4 or 5. And my brother and I were raised during formative years by her. And so I was born in Philadelphia. And so she moved out to Hollywood, California when I was like 5 or 6. And he stayed my dad stayed living in New Jersey. He still lives there to this day. And so she would make these tapes to kind of give him updates on how my brother and I were doing, and to remind him to send the alimony, that kind of thing. And one of the takes, I hear her referencing that, and you know how, you know, he still needed to send the money or something like that. Not in a bad way, just kind of like, you know, don't forget to send the check type of thing. But so he found one of these tapes and we digitized it, and it's like, it's such a trip, Harry, man, to go back and like hear myself. I think I was 7 or 8 at the time talking, and my wife listened to it and she started cracking up because there's this one scene, it's not really a scene, but there's one part of the tape where I'm like correcting my brother on how he's pronouncing something. And like sometimes she gets on me for doing that now. Like I'll correct her or somebody, and it's an annoying habit of mine that I need to stop. But it's just funny to hear, like, back when I was 7, I was doing the same thing. Like, Daddy, he didn't pronounce it right. It's really supposed to pronounce so-and-so. So anyway, given the kind of podcast I was doing, this was like audio gold, right?
Yeah.
Where, you know, in the first 2 episodes of my show I kind of say how it's called The Father Figure, and I kind of say how there's so many themes of fatherhood in the movies, and I was using that as how fatherhood was a theme that kind of related to my story as a filmmaker, because the first movie camera I ever had was a Super 8 camera that my dad had given me. And so I just incorporated those old digitized tapes, parts of them, into the storytelling, and kind of talked about, what it was like as a little kid, thinking or hoping that my parents would get back together. And how I felt the day that my mom told us that they were getting a divorce. Because even when we moved out to California, I just assumed at some point they would get back together, because I just figured that they would. And so, realizing that it was going to be permanent was something that really hit us hard. And I remember making another tape later, like asking him to come back or something. And I think we were crying. He didn't have, even if he did have that one, I don't know if he would have given it to me. But you were talking about getting personal. And the follow-up episode to that, the following episode, which I think is a 1.5, I think that may be the 1.5 you're referencing. It was the part 2 to the fatherhood episode. I'm talking to another filmmaker by the name of Patrick Moreau, and he was talking about the passing of his mother. And my mom passed away in 2008, and I was telling him the story of how every now and then I could be watching something that kind of reminds me of her, and I'll just break out in tears. In that episode, I was telling the story of how I was watching Star Trek, the J.J. Abrams reboot, and the scene where Vulcan is collapsing in on itself, and Spock goes down and try to save his mom, and she falls through she falls into the pit, or not the pit, but she falls into the abyss, and he's unable to save her. And that the look on his face when everyone else is beamed up and he loses his mother. And the first time I saw the movie, it didn't do anything to me. And then I was watching it again with my wife in bed, and I just broke out in tears. And so I shared that story on the podcast. And even on the podcast, I kind of talked about, because obviously I control whether or not what goes on the show. And it's not like some filmmaker caught me crying and included it. And it was like, no, I'm the one recording this. And I was debating whether or not, do I include it? And I decided to include it because, like you said, my show is about being personal, and it's about telling those stories, and it's about tapping into emotion in a way that is meaningful. And, even if it's the host. And, I decided to keep it in for that reason, and to let my listeners know up front that this was going to be a show where I didn't have any qualms about being raw and being open and putting myself out there.
I think, I applaud you for doing that. And I think more podcasters should do it.
Yeah.
Because quite honestly, it establishes this connection and this vulnerability that allows us to put ourselves in your shoes. That story that you just told, I imagine there's going to be countless people that are listening that can resonate, that were raised by either a single mother or a single father. And just for you to have those memories in tape format, I mean, the only thing that I might have similar is the VHS tapes, because my dad took a ton of VHS.
Oh, that's so cool.
And so we do have some things. I think one time my sister and I made a Kleenex commercial.
Very cool.
And so it's my sister's pretending she's in bed with the sniffles. And we filmed it because it was cool. You felt, when you're little and you have these toys around, and I imagine like you did with the Super 8, you're like, I'm a movie maker now.
Yeah. Well, it's bummed because because that Super 8 film, I don't have any of it. I would have loved to have had it. Yeah, that would be so awesome.
We did a superhero thing with my cousin one time where he pretended to be Superman. And so we did a scene where he's grabbing the villain and he is lifting him up. And then we did a cut to the feet, and we wanted to show the feet dangling. So he's grabbing a pipe ahead. So and then we cut to the feet, and you just see the feet in the air.
Oh, very cool. Very cool.
VHS special effects.
Yeah. I have a similar story too, about how I did my special effects. But I'm always, you talk about being personal on your show. And I would say it kind of depends on the show. I think there are some shows where it probably wouldn't necessarily warrant the host getting all personal. But definitely for a show like mine, and I could see for a lot of shows where, especially if it's a conversational one like yours is, where, it'd be cool for the host to get personal and I go all out. I mean, I have an episode where I talk about how I don't think I sound black. And the name of the episode is, Do I Sound Black? Wait.
Conveniently enough, yeah. That one will be easy to find.
Right. And it's fun. That's the one that has I think that's the one that has the Brady Bunch reference, if I'm not mistaken.
The Peter Brady time to change.
Right. Exactly. So, so I talk about that. JD clowns on me sometimes on the show, and I open up and I think if you have a show where it makes sense, it gives you an edge, because there's particularly as as podcasting has become so popular, especially if you're doing an interview style podcast. And I've done coaching for filmmakers and small business people, and the one thing that you have that no one else has is you and your voice. And as a podcaster, there's your literal voice, but also your voice and your style, what makes you unique as a person. And so, if you're creating another interview style podcast, when there are so many out there, one of the things that's going to set your show apart is your personality and who you are as a host and as a person. And so I think that if podcasting is something that you're doing, and you have an interview style show, I think it's imperative personally to really infuse and inject your show with who you are as a person, because that is going to be a key thing to set you apart.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think, as just personally, those are the shows that I relate to, because I feel like I'm sitting next to a couple of people having a conversation, as opposed to someone who's just sitting there with like his 5 questions that he needs to ask, and then the guest gives the one answer response is, and then you and then you almost sense the awkwardness, even though sometimes it's a podcast, you can hear it and just like there's like some awkward tension going on it's not fun to listen to.
Yeah, I know, and I think podcasters who are skilled in interviewing can probably overcome that. I never hear awkward pauses when I listen to Mark Maron on WTF, right? Mm-hmm. He's been doing it for years. And so I think that if this is something that someone is like new at, that, they'll get into their groove and they'll learn how to, get rid of those awkward silences, awkward pauses.
That's why one of the things I like about your show is the fact that some of the episodes are pure like filmmaking, talking to filmmakers about the art of making film, but it's so very easy to just substitute podcast for film and apply a lot of the same lessons.
Oh, sure.
that you're talking about, and you're having conversations with these filmmakers about, especially when you talk about the importance of there was a whole series and bits about learning from the masters, right? And learning from people who have done this.
Right, yeah.
Learning from people who have done this previously. So I'm wondering, because you weaved bits and parts of that throughout several episodes. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you learned from those conversations about the importance of learning from people who have come before us.
Yeah, and I like that you made that connection about, how even though I'm talking to filmmakers, you don't have to be a filmmaker to get anything from my show. Like, I think the topics that we cover, because my show, and this was the reason why I started my other podcast too, because the podcasts that were out there were all about the tech. Filmmakers and photographers really get into gear, and those are still some of the more popular podcasts, but I didn't want to have those kind of conversations. And so I think that, the topics I talk about are topics that transcend filmmaking. And so when you talk about, the masters and what we can learn from them, I think one of the key things that I learned from those interviews, and honestly, something I kind of already inherently knew or kind of believed for myself as an artist, is that we're all going to make mistakes when we're in this business. So one, knowing that it's okay to make mistakes, and knowing that some of the greatest people who came before you were mistakes. or had mistakes. You know, Steven Spielberg wasn't born the filmmaker Steven Spielberg. Like, he came into it, and most people that you admire, they had to come into their own as the artists that they are. And so, you know, so one, learning that, two, realizing that you can probably actually learn something. So I think in today's day and age, you know, these young whippersnappers who have access to YouTube and everything, I think oftentimes they feel like they can't learn anything from quote unquote old folks or from
OGs.
you know, OGs or old dead guys, right? And so but it's amazing what you'll be able to learn from old dead guys when you start studying the kind of things that they did, and when you start realizing some of the things you do now, or some of the things that some person you see on YouTube doing is actually something that was started, you know, way back in the olden days of something. And so understanding that mindset, I think, is something that is important. And then three, I think it's just like, if you really care about an art form, and podcasting, I think, is an art form, when you take the time to kind of learn what people before you have done, it gives you an appreciation for the art, because they didn't have the technology that you have. They didn't have, you know, in the olden days, people had to physically, in the olden days of radio, they had physical audio tape that they had to cut and splice together. It's very similar to film, as a matter of fact. And you know, if they wanted to go around and record people, they didn't have an iPhone that you could use, or even a small digital audio recorder that can fit in the palm of your hand. They had you know, these things that they sling over their arm with a long microphone, and so you get an appreciation for the craft that I think informs how you go about and how you approach it. So that if you know that, you know, the people who came before you kind of created this foundation, and whose shoulders you're standing on, when you have a respect for that, you come to the craft with a new form sense of respect and honor and dignity that I think informs and affects how you create that artwork yourself.
Yeah, well put. One of the things you touch upon as you talk about the inspiration of films is the importance of looking at things outside of your genre for inspiration. And you can tie that to filmmaking. And I think of it from a podcast perspective. Like, I listen, to other genres of podcasts because I discover this huge, open field of people that are doing fantastic things. And that's how I found your show. And you wouldn't think, oh, let me listen to a film podcast. And I think the beauty of what I'm doing is I'm almost more focused on what the host is doing and how they structure the show and how they put their show together, and looking for people that are interesting to have conversations about there, because you can only talk so much about the technical, right? And then you just start to sound like every other show.
Right. No, I think that's so smart. I'm the same way. I listen to so many different types of podcasts, different formats, different genres, and different topics. Obviously I mentioned This American Life. I listen to other filmmaking podcasts like Collider and /Filmcast, but I listen to podcasts about social issues that are going on. I listen to comedy podcasts. They're just two people talking and rapping, and so not rapping like rap music, but talking and rapping. So yeah, I think definitely, and I think you get something from that in terms of, even if you're listening to a podcast that isn't the same format as yours, I think if you listen to other podcasts that are in different genres, different formats, it can give you ideas of how to make yours a little bit different. Maybe there's a little aspect of that talk show style that I want to inject into mine, or maybe there's a certain way of how that person does interviews that I want to try out in mine. So yeah, there's a lot you can get from listening to other podcasters for sure.
I was thinking really quickly briefly about using other films as inspiration, and so I saw something recently. I don't know if you've seen it yet. A film called Victoria.
I haven't seen it yet, but I know about it, and I definitely want to do it.
It's it's a single shot.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is because last year Birdman was famously known for being a a supposed one long shot, but they use a lot of editing tricks in order to make that. And but Victoria is a movie where it is literally one unbroken take. And from the interviews I've heard, I think it was like the fourth or the fifth take of the film before they got it just right. But they started rolling, and I haven't seen it yet. I just heard some amazing things about it. But yeah, they start the camera rolling, and for the next 90 minutes, what happens in real time. And I heard it's quite an adventure or quite an experience. I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, it's mind blowing because I love we watch a lot of film and indie films as well. And so when we saw that, I actually enjoy watching trailers more than
sometimes a lot of times they're better than the movie.
So sometimes I have the Apple TV and I'll just go to the trailer section. I just start.
I'm the same way. I'm the same way. We're so alike, dude. It's so funny.
And then. And that's where I find all these awesome movies. It's like, oh my God, I got to watch that. Because if you can, although sometimes the best parts are in the trailer, but that when they talked about that movie, I was like, whoa, I got to see it. And then when you watch it, you get, the story's really good, but I'm watching it from two angles because I'm sucked into this like technical aspect of like how they pull this off, and they're going upstairs and downstairs and down the street and in cars, and I'm like, oh my God, this is like it really is a single take, and it's so crazy.
Yeah. I can't wait to see it. I might probably have to wait till it's on iTunes or Netflix or something.
Yeah. So I was wondering, just to use a familiar film reference, Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, right?
Of course. Yeah. I talked about that on the show.
Yeah. And, we talk, people, I've heard people reference it also in online marketing and podcasting, and it's just a very common story about the arc of anyone, and you could relate it to film, you could relate it to your professional career, you could relate it to
absolutely,
whatever aspect life. You want to life. I'm wondering if you could take a moment to think about where you are right now in your own hero's journey.
It's getting deep. That's an excellent question. Part of me wants to say that I'm still in the belly of the whale, the abyss part. The hero's journey talks about, and one of the more famous movies that adheres to that is Star Wars, the original Star Wars, and it's this. Part of the journey is like, the hero gets a call, he refuses the call, and then he goes on the adventure, and then he goes through the abyss before he comes out the other side. And so, in a sense, as I'm a small business person, and we recently moved out here to, Seattle, and, moving out here was kind of like starting over. Like in terms of finding new video clients, starting this new content production, content marketing side of the business. And so there's that tough part of when you're kind of like starting new and fresh again, and the challenges that you face, and using all of my experience as a business person in order to kind of grow the company, what we're doing. And so I kind of feel like I'm at that part of the journey where you're facing those challenges that you face as a small business person. And, I kind of feel like I'm going through that fight right now in terms of not only building the business, but also balancing that with, being a husband and a dad. And, one of the podcasts I listen to is Gary Vaynerchuk, and he's always talking about the hustle and work. And, if I had my druthers, I would work easily 16 hours a day, but I can't do that, as a husband and a father. And so really balancing that makes me feel like, okay, that's where I am in my hero's journey now.
Very cool.
Yeah.
One of the things you said in one of the shows was the journey is the only thing. There's no destination.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And I think it's, again, especially if you're an artist, but I think you can play this to anyone who's a small business person, that I don't know if I ever want to arrive, at a destination. I always want to be growing. And, you think it's kind of like how the days leading up to Christmas are really more exciting than Christmas itself. Like Christmas comes and it's cool, you open it, but then it's like, it was a lot more fun leading up. It's like the 12 days I never knew where are the 12 days of Christmas, but it's like the days leading up to Christmas are always more exciting than Christmas itself. And I think that's what the whole journey is like too. Like that when you're on the journey of whether it's a journey of being a podcaster and you're starting out for the first time, or you're in some kind of an artist, that the adventures you have and the people you meet on that are what make life exciting. And so I think we all go through life with different journeys. So you go whether it's in the early years, those are kind of defined by school. You have elementary school, middle school. In my day, it was called junior high, high school, college, whatnot. And then you have the journey of the 20s where you're kind of discovering, love for the first, maybe not for the first time, but for a lot of people in their 20s, that's when they're finding like who's going to be their mate or whatnot, or kind of that they kind of start their journey as a career. So you go through these ebbs and flows and these hills and valleys, and whatever you decide to make as your passion in life, the journey of getting to a quote unquote destination is always going to be the more fulfilling part. And every time you reach the top of another hill, be looking for the next hill, and actually be looking for the next valley too, because even though it's going to be scary going in it, the only way you can get to the next hill and that excitement and that elation is by going through that valley. And sometimes the valleys will be simple and shallow, and sometimes they'll be swamp infested with dragons flying over and dead bodies floating in the water. It's a Lord of the Rings reference.
Yeah. Who doesn't like fire-breathing dragons, man?
That's right.
I always think about in terms of frequency. I use the term frequency a lot in my life, like frequency in terms of vibe and how I vibe with people and people's frequency, and whether you meet someone, they come into the room for the first time, you're like, oh man, bad mojo, or whatever the hell you want to call it.
Right.
But when you break it down to its most elemental level, we're all vibrating atoms, and I think of that sine wave, right? And so
I was thinking that
you got to have the valley in order to have the peaks, and hopefully as you get more wise, that the valleys become shorter. And the peaks last longer.
Yeah. Well, I like to stand out. I prefer to go with the cosine waves because those are
nerd alert.
Right, nerd alert. All the math geeks out there are like, yeah, Ron, go for it.
Oh, that's funny.
Right. I think that's a great analogy.
The other aspect of the hero's journey is the importance of mentors. Oh,
yeah, you're right. Absolutely.
So I'm wondering how they've played a role in getting to you where you're at now.
That's a good question. So, like, I think if I think about people who have been, like, I can't, off the top of my head, like, I can't think of anyone who's sort of like an Obi-Wan Kenobi type mentor to me when it comes to issues like that. But I think there are people who I have admired, who I definitely like learn from, who, whether it's other filmmakers, I think probably, some of the closest things I've had to mentors in the sense of a mentorship have been more like mentors in life. So like mentors maybe in my faith walk, or mentors mentors for me as a husband and as a father. When I think about the kind of formal mentors that I've had, people like that come to mind in terms of, older men I've turned to get advice about marriage and fatherhood and whatnot. So I think that those are the more traditional mentors I've had. I think with respect to my career, I remember when I first started out going to some people who had been in the business a long time, kind of picking their brain. But for me, it's mainly been like looking at people that I admire and kind of gleaning from them what they've learned, what I can learn from them in terms of the experiences that they've had. But I don't think I've ever had like a formal training mentor, but I've tried to be mentors. Like I have a mentorship program, where I have filmmakers come out and I mentor them in exchange for them helping me on my projects, and I give them mentorship in business and in filmmaking and whatnot. And I started it when I was in California, and then I did it when I was in Atlanta, and I've started it here as well too. So I definitely believe in it, and something that I try to do myself. And I mean, I kind of wish I had a formal mentor with respect to my career as a filmmaker, like someone who was local that I could turn to, or someone that I could have like a filmmaking mastermind session with. I think maybe that's one of the things I get from my podcast, because I talk to so many really talented filmmakers, where I've had some great sessions and feedback from other filmmakers. So a lot of ways, I guess my show is my mentor in a sense, or the guests that I have are like mentors to me, because I'm able to, which is one of the things I love about podcasting. Like you have this excuse to talk to people who are so much better at whatever it is that you do, have them come on and pick their brain and get a lot of insight from them.
Nice way to bring it back around to podcasting.
Yeah, always trying, always trying.
So we'll wrap up in a bit. Just a couple more questions.
Yeah, sure.
What have you changed your mind about recently?
Oh, that's a good question. What have I changed my mind about recently? I feel like there's something like on the tip of my tongue that I want to say. I have ADHD, so sometimes it's hard for me to remember stuff. But I think, let me come back to that one.
Okay.
Because there's one on the tip of my tongue, because I know there's something that I have. All right, I'll go with this. So I think one thing I've changed my mind about is my outlook on how to handle disagreements with my wife about the business. I think when you have a small business and it's you and your spouse, and you're dealing with, trying to, like I was saying before, trying to balance between life and business and work-life balance. And before I had this mindset of, always having to prove why I need to work X number of hours per week, and, but Gary Vaynerchuk says this and all that kind of thing. And so I've decided to come at it differently and stop fighting with my wife, who's supposed to be the most important person in my life, right? More important than the podcast, more important than the business, and say, okay, how can I take the schedule that would be most beneficial to her in order to feel like she's loved, and for her to feel like I'm contributing to the household in a way that's not just, buried in my computer all the time, and do it in a way that, like, I can get done what needs to get done, and what I can focus on, and how I can have a different perspective and how to look at it. So rather than always trying to fight the cause or give a debate as to why I need something else, to say, okay, I'm going to come at it from this different angle, and I'm going to make it work within the time frame that makes sense for our family. And so I think that's one thing that comes to mind in terms of, something I've changed my mind about, just the perspective of how I approach those kind of discussions. Because I think, I have no doubt if there are other couples out there who have small businesses, this is a topic that comes up. And just based on the interviews I've done with artists over the past, 7 years or whatever, I know it comes up a lot.
So if the listener wants...
Oh, there's another thing I've changed my mind about. I just thought about it. I think I've changed my mind about the series finale of Lost. So when the series finale of Lost first came out, I was a huge proponent, positive for it. I even did a whole blog post about it. But over the years, it sat with me, and now I think I have an issue with it. I think I have a problem with the series finale of Lost now. That's a big thing I've changed my mind about.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it went completely off the rails. I don't know what the hell happened there.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I mean, one thing that was like, I guess, so spoiler alert, if you're watching Lost and you haven't seen the series finale, but like, so at the end where Jack was his name, right?
Yeah.
Where like it ends with him like looking up and he sees the plane flying over, and they never show like how the hell did he get up out of the thing? Like, and like, you know, the original quote unquote smoke monster was created because he fell in that hole, and he never get out. How did Jack get out? How did he get out?
It's so funny with one of my friends who's someone I interviewed before. He's Jason Kabasi of the Walking Dead cast.
Oh wow!
Cool. We're working on Podcastica, which is our podcast network together, right. and so we geek out, and there's a whole section in there just TV talk where we're just like we're talking about the new show, The Leftovers, as well. And Damon Lindelof is producer of that, and the danger with creating a show where it gets so supernatural and out there is, I mean, at some point you're either gonna have to decide to try to wrap it up or just say F it, you know, just like, no, I'm not gonna even try to make sense of what I just did for the past 5 seasons, and I know, and we'll see you later. Yeah. And then you're stuck with that.
Right. And as a storyteller, I'm not one that feels you have to explain everything.
Yeah. But
when you throw out as many different mysteries as that show did, you got to explain. I feel like they need to explain more than they did.
Yeah.
Like there were some things, like there was, like I didn't need to know how they moved the island. Like that's not, but there was one thing that came up a lot was like this specific coordinates that you had to use to get either on or off the island. That went nowhere. Like I wanted to, like that's the kind of thing where it's like, okay, that's the kind of thing I want to know. Like, why was that such a big deal? Like, there are some things you bring up that I think there's some things as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, this is kind of like a delicate balance. I think there's some things that you show the audience that are either just MacGuffins, they kind of just lead the story on, and there's no need to really understand them. You know, a great example is that's used as a MacGuffin is the glow from Pulp Fiction, the glow from inside, you know, Marcellus's suitcase.
So just explain to the listener who might not know what MacGuffin is.
Essentially, a MacGuffin is a storytelling element that kind of like propels a story along, and it doesn't necessarily have to have an explanation. It's just there to kind of get the story going. It's, you know, the people who are in the story or in the movie are after it. It's the catalyst, if you will. And so in Pulp Fiction, for the story of, you know, Sam Jackson and John Travolta's character, they had to get back that suitcase, and they, you know, one scene, you know, whenever the suitcase is open, there's this glow that comes out of it. You never know what it is. You know, so I've heard some people say that it's the soul of Marcellus Wallace. I've heard some people say that it's gold, but it's really not something that's important. They don't really talk about it. They don't reference it, right? But when you specifically bring up something like it's very important that you enter this island at coordinate X34, longitude ABC, whatever, and you bring it up multiple times, normally getting on, how you get on and off the island is not something that you need to make a big deal about. So if you make a big deal about it, I want to know why I need to get in and off those specific coordinates. And then why in the future you seem to kind of like throw that out and people are getting on and off without those coordinates anymore. So yeah, I've changed my mind about the series finale of Lost, I think.
What's amazing is that so many years after that show ended, that it's something that just popped into your mind. No, really, I'm over
2010.
it. 2010. Yeah, it's like, I'm over it. No, really. Yeah, that's cool, man. So only advice I can give is let it go, man.
Yeah, I've let it go.
So this has been fun, Ron.
Yeah.
This is really
awesome.
I had a feeling we'd have a good time, and
well, we have a lot in common besides from the same generation. Just like when you went off on the whole breakdancing thing, I was like, oh, we're gonna connect. We're gonna connect. This is gonna get real in a minute.
Oh yeah. So we're gonna have our podcast battle.
For sure.
So I'm tempted to open up a couple other rabbit holes, but in the interest
Go for
of
it. You can always edit them out. Throw them at the end of the episode as like bonus content.
Yeah, you do a good job of that. I like that. You know, it just kind of speaks to this whole concept of repurposing content that you have, and just like, why waste it?
Yeah.
I like how you had a whole segment about interviewing women filmmakers.
Oh, right.
And it was important, and it resonated with me because I think about the concept of like women in podcasting, and I try to have a balance. And you made a point to say, I need to have more women filmmakers on, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so I was like, well, I need to make sure I've got enough women podcasters who are voicing their opinion, because it's just it adds a whole different dynamic. And I recently had Grace and Eric, who host a show called Under the Comic Covers, and he stated like the importance of having a female co-host. That's something that was critical for the dynamic of the show. So I'm wondering if that's colored anything that you've thought of as you're looking to grow the show.
What specifically? Female?
Just the importance of having a balanced perspective.
I mean, I think for my show, it's really important, which is why I, made the effort to reach out and get more female filmmakers on the show. Even on my last podcast, Crossing the 180, I did something similar. I was like, wow, everyone I'm interviewing are male. And I had a women in filmmaking kind of like series stint on that show as well. So I think, obviously the talk of diversity has been really big, particularly in, my industry, the filmmaking movie industry, because of the Oscars. I'm not sure when this episode is going to air, but one of the big things has been the lack of diversity amongst the Oscar nominees. And so there's a lot of talk in Hollywood about changes to how the Academy nominates people for the awards. And there's a lot of talk about diversity in Hollywood, and not only from a racial perspective, but also from a female perspective, from women in the industry. Jennifer Lawrence has had this open letter that she sent out about how, when the Sony hack happened, emails that people at Sony had about the salaries that she and her other co-stars of, what's the name of that movie that David O. Russell forgot? It was like American Hustle? American Hustle, right. How her male co-stars made more than her, even the ones who aren't necessarily as big a star as she is. And so, I think, and so with all these conversations going, the common theme, even in podcasting, I would say I've been hearing conversations. So a podcast I listen to is Startup Podcast by Gimlet Media. They had a whole episode about diversity.
Oh yeah.
And then the podcast, there's the people who do the podcast movement, they have a podcast. And they had a segment about diversity where they had the host from Another Round, the two female hosts from Another Round talking. And the thing that comes up is that because you have a diverse audience, it only behooves you and benefits your show when you have diversity, because there's a larger audience that you're speaking to, and who are going to relate to the people on your show and the stories on your show. And if you have a show where the people listening never feel like they hear someone who kind of represents them, whether it represents them from a racial, represents them from a gender, or represents them from a career, a role, standpoint, that they'll be less inclined to want to tune in all the time, and they don't ever feel like they're hearing anyone that kind of represents who they are as well, or someone that they can relate to. So I think, the more diversity you can have on your show, I think the better. It also makes for more interesting conversation.
Yeah, it was interesting because one of the women on your show mentioned the fact that she never had anyone to aspire to. Since early on there weren't a lot of female directors, she couldn't point to one and say, "Oh, I know that that's possible because I see a person that's doing it. That's a female."
Right.
So I think it's just a conscious effort to be aware of that, and You never know. I think we sometimes take for granted how impressionable young children are, and how
for sure,
and how they can see, just by virtue of seeing someone doing something, understand that it's now in their capacity to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something that came up a few times. The idea of, when these filmmakers were younger, who they looked up to as other filmmakers or potential filmmakers.
Very cool. Okay, one last one.
Yeah, go for it.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
The most misunderstood thing. I would have to say, all right, so this is going to be interesting. So I would guess that people would probably think I'm more liberal than I actually am. Like, if you were to ask Ron, like, is he a Republican or a Democrat? I'm neither, by the way.
Yeah.
But in terms of like my personal beliefs and philosophies and stint, I probably have a much stronger conservative stint than I think people would assume if they were like just to see how I interact. And I think that could be for a lot of reasons. Could be because I think, because I'm African American, and a lot of things that I speak out against are issues that you don't necessarily hear a lot of conservatives speak out against. So like, I'm very passionate about fighting against injustices in our country and our world, and like sex trafficking and hunger and that kind of thing. And, particularly the plight of African American men in this country and what they've been going through. And so, I think I could see that as being something that people may misunderstand about me, that, and I haven't heard anyone speak to this, so that's just a guess on my part, in terms of, how I, the kind of things that I talk about publicly, the kind of standpoint, the kind of understanding a person might have of the kind of person I am based on what they see or what they hear. Obviously, I alluded to it earlier, but like my faith informs a lot of kind of decisions I make. And I think there are a lot of people who, I'm a Christian, so I think there are a lot of people who call themselves Christian who don't do or look anything like who I believe the person of Jesus was. And so I think that, that's one thing that really defines like kind of like what direction I go, which is why I don't call myself really liberal or conservative. I'm just this person who's trying to live a certain way and try to treat people a certain way. And so I think that I've never been one to even like titles in the first place, but I would guess that if people were to put a title on me, that's probably the title they would put. And that would be a misunderstanding of who Ron Dawson is as a person.
Well, amen.
Yeah. Preach up.
Well, Ron, I want to thank you for making the time to come on.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
And
great.
Hope you enjoyed our conversation. I had as much fun as I thought I would have prior to starting.
So I did too.
So what's the best place for folks to track you down online?
Probably Twitter. My Twitter is Dare Dreamer FM. That's my company, Dare Dreamer FM. If you want to check out the podcast, just radiofilmschool.com will get you to all the shows. And obviously, subscribe in iTunes and leave a rating and review, because that really helps the show, which I'm sure you know. Yeah,
as all podcasters know. Please go ahead. I highly recommend you folks check out the show. It's definitely on my must play queue now.
Thank you.
So
Appreciate it, man.
And I'm really excited about what you have coming, because if what you've put out so far is any indication, it's going to be some quality stuff.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Take care and have a fantastic day.
All right, you too.
So I think you got a good feeling for just how well we vibed on that show. And one of my to-dos is to actually make it over to the Brady Bunch house, which is 15 minutes away from me. So it's a shame that I haven't done so already, but having grown up with that show, it's something that I need to do ASAP. So thanks to Cedar and Soil for providing the intro outro music. Check them out at cedarsoil.com. And that's my good buddy George. and he's doing some fantastic work there. So when you get a chance, please go and check that out. As I referenced at the top of the show, we are a member of Podcastica, and now we're happy to have the One Mind Meditation Podcast as part of our growing family. So check out all the shows at podcastica.com. And if you want to support the show, there's 3 things that I need all of you to do. So focus, put down the phone. No, actually, don't put that on the phone because you might not be able to listen to what I have to say. So scratch that. So anyway, just focus and stop trying to multitask and just listen. I said 3 things, right? So the first is most importantly, subscribe. Subscribe to the show, and then that way you get all the updates. You hear all the cool shows, guests that we have on. And I'm actually going to be including some new episodes that I call Podcast Junkies Elsewhere, where I've been featured on as a guest on other podcasts. And I think they provide more insight into me as the host of this show. And so I think I'll tag them differently in the iTunes. And so that way you can tell which ones are regular episodes and which ones are bonus ones. So that way, if you want to, you can just skip them and just listen to the regular weekly shows. So that's why it's important to subscribe, because you don't want to miss all that stuff. If you're new to the show, I highly recommend you head on over to podcastjunkies.com/iTunes and listen to 5 episodes that catch your attention and get a feel for what this show is about. And then you'll figure out what everyone else is talking about when they're saying that Podcast Junkies is just the most amazing show for podcasters, about podcasters who like to podcast about podcasting with their podcasts. Whew. Secondly, if you're getting value out of it, make sure you tell other people. So pick one person. Thank you, iPhone reminder. Pick one person that you're going to tell the show, that you're going to talk to about the show this week. Do it. And then send me a text. And the first person to tweet me at podcast_junkies with the tagging someone that they mentioned the show to who's new, that you got them to subscribe, will get a free t-shirt from me. So hurry on up and do that, and I'll keep an eye out. Lastly, but not leastly's not a word, but I just said it. Head on over to iTunes if you haven't done so already. Leave me a review, which is the lifeblood of the show. So I do that for regulars. And for regular listeners, if you've already left a rating and a review for my show, go leave a rating and a review for another show. Someone that you listen to week in, week out, and you said, you know what? I always check the show, and I've been meaning to do that review for them, but I haven't done so. Do that. Use this opportunity to think about the shows that you get value from week in and week out, and go ahead and show them some love, because they really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. Podcasting is our lifeblood, and we want to keep on doing it. And there's nothing better than the social proof of seeing a lot of 5-star reviews on iTunes to show new listeners that this is something they should be checking out. So thanks again. And if you've made it this far, then I think we're going to use something that's related to, let's see, something about film school. So we'll talk, since we talked about that at length and about movies and old school. Okay, since Ron mentioned his crush on Jan, I think what we'll do is do Ron and Jan as the hashtag. RONANDJAN, hashtag Ron and Jan, and tag myself, podcast_junkies, and Dare Dreamer FM, which is Ron's Twitter handle. I'm sure he'll get a kick out of that. Thanks again, guys. Looking forward to next week, where we chat to other members of the Podcastica family, Brittany and Amanda from Once Upon a Podcast. And that's a really fun and funny conversation. And those ladies rock. So don't miss that. Take care. Have a fantastic week, and go spread the podcasting love across the podverse. See ya.